Right. Oh, could you, I've got a little, can I see, turn the
Oh,
clock
yes.
towards me? I'm notorious for talking too long, so I'll have the clock to keep me in check, hopefully. So, I'm going to talk, well, this Dharma talk's called, excuse me, to study the self is to forget the self. So that's a famous or infamous quote from Dogen, from Shobogenzo, from Genjokoan specifically. And just a little bit of history on Genjokoan itself. You know, Dogen went to China in 1224, when he's 24 years old, to kind of seek the truth of Zen, to answer a pressing spiritual question that he had. And while he was there, he broke through that question and became a Zen master himself. And he returned to Japan in 1227 or 1228, and he wrote a couple little things right when he got back. But then he spent about 6 years or so just kind of, don't really quite know, but kind of stewing it over, trying to figure out, you know, how to live this enlightened existence that he had discovered in China. And you know, he began writing the Shobogenzo, which is kind of his master's thesis on how to live the life of a Buddha, basically. And in 1223 or 1233, when he was 33 years old, he wrote what became, in most versions of the Shobogenzo, at least in the one that he put together, the very first opening chapter, which is Genjokoan. And he actually wrote it for a lay practitioner, so not even for a monk. Just, we don't really know much about this guy. He lived in Kyushu, but he must have been a heck of a practitioner if Dogen wrote this fascicle for him. So I don't know how many of you have read the Genjokoan, but it's like a summary, a greatest hits collection of his main topics that he will just keep returning to over and over again in the Shobogenzo and his teaching in general. I'm just going to talk about 5 sentences from it. And probably you could do a whole book on every one of those sentences, but we're going to cram it all into a half hour. So we'll see how that goes for all of us. Just the title itself, you know, you could talk about that forever. A lot of different translations. Maybe the most common, but the one that I also like the most is called Actualizing the Fundamental Point. What the heck does that mean? So, you know, we just chanted the Heart Sutra, and we're talking about form and emptiness. These two things that are the same thing, inextricably intertwined in each other. Dogen is saying that his teaching in this respect is to show you how to live a life that is truly both form and emptiness. You wouldn't even say the synthesis of the two, because they're the same thing. You know, they're exactly the same. It's just that this body and mind, the way that it's set up, we have to look at form and emptiness as two different things. It's just one of those, it's our karma, like our birthright. We split the world into pieces, but he's going to try to show us how to get them back together. And just a little, they call it, little teisho on form and emptiness. So what are form and emptiness? Form, literally, is just what the eye sees. It's also kind of called materiality, material things. It's this whole world of objects that are split apart from each other. Just the whole world, like I see a tree there, and then like a floor here, then myself here, and we're all completely just separate objects going off on our separate individual existences. But with emptiness, it says there's no intrinsic existence. That separateness that we see out in the world, that's not really how it is. Everything is completely intertwined with everything else. Kind of like this table here, you know, it just looks like a table, and we tell ourselves a story about, I guess it's a dais, we'll call it a table for now, table for the little computer. You look at it, it's a table, but you know, why don't we talk about it as like an oddly embarrassing stage in the life cycle of a tree? You know, it's a tree, isn't it? This is all made up out of tree parts, but for some reason we can look at it and be table. Another way I like to talk about emptiness is that, if you take this table and get like a belt sander, just a real industrial strength belt sander, and you start sanding it down, at what molecule in this whole collection does it stop being a deus? There has to be a point. Just show me that one molecule. Deus, not deus anymore. That sounds crazy, right? But that's how we think about this thing. It's its own thing that exists separately from everything else, but it doesn't. That's the same is true of us. We're like these little tiny dots that move around the world, and we're completely separate from everything else, but we're not separate from everything else, right? Right? I don't know if you're convinced, but we'll see if Dogen can convince us all. Yeah. And really, one of the main ways that emptiness manifests in life is part of this whole collection of ideas and experiences, but everything's impermanent. Everything's always changing shape. Everything's always changing form. This is the deus right now. It's got chips taken out of it. And at some point, it'll probably be, maybe it'll be turned into firewood. Maybe it'll be thrown in a garbage heap, and then it'll just disintegrate and turn back into who knows what, another tree or a playground. It doesn't have this fixed form that lasts forever. Things are always changing. So Dogen's trying to get us to live with both of those experiences, those conceptual ways of seeing, just how things actually are, how to get into the idea where we look at this world where everything's separate, but then actually we're not separate at all. It sounds crazy, but that's the way when our minds are split into two pieces, we split everything else up into two pieces. So how do we live with those two pieces back together? Let's see. Heart Sutra. Yeah. So I'll read you the 5 sentences. And then, you've probably heard some of these before if you've been around Soto Zen at all. I think Daishin was talking about some of these last time he was here. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by the myriad things. When actualized by the myriad things, your body and mind, as well as the body and mind of others, drop away. No trace of realization remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. Right? Crystal clear? Good old Dogen. Yes. So as philosophical as this sounds, he's really just giving us practice instructions, like ways to try this practice on and see how it works for you. Although he talks about it, of course, in this way that kind of seems very esoteric, mystical. I mean, it can be as well, because life is very complicated, but I'm going to talk more about this is what he's talking. This is the practice. Get yourself into this mode, because he's always talking about zazen. Like it's in not even in a peripheral way. But everything he talks about, he's a huge zazen stan, so he's always coming back to zazen over and over and over again. So I'm gonna try to translate each of these sentences into normal, everyday speak. And see how you try that on and see if this works for you. So the very first one, to study the Buddha way, is to study the self. I translated this as, to practice Buddhism, we need to study the self. We need to study what it is that we are and how we act, why we act. So I would say that when we begin practicing Zazen, we become a subject expert on ourselves. Like our most intense field of study is the body-mind that we have. The more we know about this, the more we can understand how other people are functioning in the world. It's like a reciprocal relationship. In the practice itself, there's no name put it a way that I really, really liked. I think I've talked about this before, but it's worth repeating over and over again. Zazen is not about cultivating a particular state of mind, but it's actually a method. So we're not, yeah, right. Like, I thought I was supposed to end my suffering and be happy, right? Isn't that the whole point of it? That will, hopefully, I say that will happen. Definitely, most likely will happen. If you put the time on the cushion and you're studying what this thing is, you will slowly grow to push the unskillful ways of being out of the way and cultivate more skillful ones. But the way that we do that is by the three, not doing the three poisons. Like, it's another thing I'm always reiterating, we're not, whatever arises, thoughts, feelings, memories, stuff outside, like yesterday, squirrels barking at each other, or like the raccoons that were on the roof for like a week. I don't know if I told you about that, but just, yeah, that's for another time. And we just look at what arises. We don't try to push it away, we don't try to hold on to it, and we don't try to ignore it. So whatever comes up, we turn that light around and look right at it. For me, it's always, I was talking about this yesterday, things I did in high school that I'm like, ooh, I probably shouldn't have done that. That pops up in my Zazen, and my long-term Zazen, we do like a day-long sit. I'm always thinking about, like, oh my God, what did I do? So I'm not trying to be like, I never did that. I claim no responsibility for that, or, I'm not like, oh yeah, I'm just this terrible, horrible person. I did that and I deserve all the punishment I can get. And also don't try to be like, oh, I'm sitting here in Zazen, I shouldn't even be thinking about anything. I'm just gonna push it out of my mind. None of those three. Simply looking at what happens inside here. Those three, I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but each of those three is how a self emerges. A self is not a thing that exists as a separate kernel, but it's an action. And it's the action of pushing things away that we don't like, pulling things closer that we do like, and ignoring everything else. Like, those three actions will create this self. And that's where that delusion comes from. And that's where all these, unskillful practices that we use to deal with our suffering emerge from. So that's sentence one. I also like to say all the time, watch what comes up. It's like a cloud, even those painful memories, or maybe sometimes happy memories or distracting thoughts that pop up during Zazen, or like clouds, they kind of bubble up out of the ether, they parade through your body mind for a little bit, and then they just fall away. If you try to put that energy that you put into them to either get rid of them or to hold on to them or ignore them, that's that self coming up, which is inextricably linked with dukkha, because you can't get it away. You put that energy into a thought and it just keeps re-upping itself. It's renewing its lease inside of your mind for however long you're either trying to get rid of it or hold on to it. But ultimately, it's like everything else, it's just gonna fade away and disappear. Second sentence. To study the self is to forget the self. This is the big one. For me, it seems pretty straightforward, but like, how do you forget the self? Let me see. I translated it as, when we look for a self, no matter how hard we look, we're not going to find one that's permanent. We're not going to find one that remains unchanged throughout our entire lifetime. I started thinking about it, I'm like, I feel like I'm like the same person that I was when I was 5 years old, right? I mean, there's something that's the same, right? But I thought about it, it's not exactly the same, because I definitely wouldn't want to, we'll say the 15-year-old me, I wouldn't let 15-year-old me, if I could transport him to now, make the decisions for my life. like in that respect, it's like, oh, I'm not that guy, because that is a completely different guy. But isn't there something that stays the same? Like there's some type of essence that carries over. I'm trying to think. I do talk more about that in the next one, but yeah, put that on hold for a second. It's just, even just the idea that things are staying the same is another seed that births a self. Things are always constantly changing, but I'm finding something that doesn't change. What is that something that doesn't change in me? Well, it's not my memories. Those change. I'm making new memories nonstop. It's not. Is it my body? Well, the body's constantly renewing. It's getting new cells and stuff. Like, what is it actually that's always staying the same? We'll get to it. The other thing to note is the word forget. Now, it seems like it's an active process, but we're not talking about ignoring the self or what we think is the self, or pushing the self away. It's more like the type of forgetting that you do when you know, or when I walk upstairs to grab something, and by the time I get to the top of the stairs, so many thoughts have gone through my head that I forget what I was even going up there for, or across the house or whatever. You know, you've been so filled with so much other things that just the thought of the self just kind of disappears by itself. In the context of Zazen, it would be, we're so filled with just this entire life that the thought of just this little tiny bit of solidity inside of us just doesn't, there's no even room for it, because we're filled with all these other things. So the third one, I'll pick up some of the thoughts that I left dangling in the last one. To forget the self is to be actualized by the myriad things. So that's what I was just talking about. Translation: when you've been looking for the self for so long, you've been unable to find it, you know, to the point where you simply forget to even look for it anymore. What replaces it is what's always already been there. You know, the rest of your entire life, you know, the world around you, the people that you love, you know, everything that's just constantly, you know, that constantly flowing and intermingling of life. I guess the question would come up, at least for me, is like, what does a life like that look like? You know, the trick is that you already have no self, so it doesn't look much different from what you already have right now. It's just there's a little tiny bit of ignorance you're able to, delusion you're able to pick out of that life. So I was trying to find a metaphor for it. So it's kind of like if you're in a powerful stream and you're holding onto a big boulder that's just covered with that green muck that it gets around it, and it's just flowing fast, and you're just holding on for dear life, but because it's so slippery, you can never have you're just re-upping that handhold and just holding on for dear life, and like, I don't want to be swept away by this river, and it's just powerful current. And at some point, you just, either you let go, or the causes and conditions come together and you slip, and all of a sudden you find yourself flowing down this river super fast. But you take a deep breath and you just kind of go, and there's not even an issue anymore, because you're floating on top of the river and you kind of equalize with that speed. That's like the flow of life. And then all those fears that you had about letting go, and like, I have to hold on to this. I have to hold on to this. Things are gonna go terrible if I slip and go on the stream of life. But once you're on that stream of life, it's just, you're floating. That's it. You're able to relax for a second now and look at all the beautiful trees and birds and wildlife and feel the warmth, the coolness of the water, and you're just going along with everything. Kind of also thought about it like when you're riding a bike for the first time with no training wheels, and you get on a big boy bike or a big girl bike or whatever it is, and you've got this whole thing like, I'm gonna fall. Like, how do you stay up? It's so scary. But once you get on the bike, it really just does all the work for you. You put a little bit of pedaling in, you just kind of steer where you want to go, and then the physics of the whole situation just take care of themselves. You don't have to have this entire conceptual framework of me holding this bike, and then you have to have like the physics equations and the force and all that, and the rotation of the wheel, and how the tires fit on the ground, and like all that. You don't need all that. It just does it for you. You're just going. Let's see. Fourth sentence. When actualized by the myriad things, your body and mind, as well as the body and mind of others, drop away. So this is Datsuraku. I think you can remember about the Dogen's way of explaining what enlightenment is. Datsuraku is the same metaphor. It's the same word they use for when a butterfly exits its cocoon. So it's kind of, there's the caterpillar, then there's a cocoon, and then there's a butterfly. And in the caterpillar, there's the promise of the butterfly. And in the butterfly, you still have, I don't know if it's not the promise of the caterpillar, but you have to have the caterpillar in order to be the butterfly. And you have to have the cocoon as well. It's like all three. You need this whole sequence in order to fulfill that potential. For us, it's you need the zazen. The zazen's like a cocoon. You need the zazen to actualize the promise of the Buddha that's within the enlightenment that we inherently have. But it's not just, it's lonely us, then zazen, and boom, we're a Buddha. For Dogen, it's this constant, we're always the caterpillar, we're always in the cocoon, and we're always the butterfly, always simultaneously. Since there's no self that can be any one of those all the time, always, we're constantly morphing in this whole scenario. I never gave you my translation of it. So this is Dogen's way of talking about enlightenment from the perspective of a world, which is this world, where we're already enlightened. We have everything that we need to wake up, but we just have to drop our idea of existing as these permanent, separate beings in order to actualize it. And this one's tough. There's all these different types of metaphors that Dogen gives that are people are just like, what is he talking about? He gives the metaphor of firewood turning into ash, but he says, don't think that firewood turns into ash. That's not how it is. You're like, what are you talking about? And we got the sticks, and you throw them in the fire, and they turn into ash, right? Dogen's like, no, it's not like that. They really don't turn into ash. Crazy. There's easier metaphors to understand this by, I think. He gives one about autumn, spring turning into summer, or summer turning into autumn. You don't say that, summer is this thing that just exists independently as a self, as an entity that's unchanging, and then summer, quote unquote, turns into autumn. There's not this being of summer that like a caterpillar going into a cocoon and coming out as a butterfly. There's not a summer that goes into a cocoon and comes out as autumn. And so what is summer and autumn? Summer is this whole confluence of causes and conditions. The sun and the earth are in a certain place. You've got a certain tilt of the atmosphere. The winds are coming down. The trees and the plants are getting more sunlight, so they start to bloom. So it's like this whole collection of things that come together to make up what we call summer. And then as it's turning into autumn, the earth and the sun have a different relationship. Our days are becoming shorter. It's getting colder outside. The flowers are no longer blooming. We're getting ready to go to sleep for the winter. That, just like summer, is this whole series of causes and conditions and situations that all come together that we just, call autumn. Same is true of us. There's no summer self, no essence of summer, just like us. We're a whole confluence of causes and conditions coming together. Like parents have to meet. We have to go to school and have to learn how to talk. Everything that comes together. All the food we eat. We have to have the sun and the earth below us. We need to have they say you have to have the entire universe coming together in order to actualize itself in us. Final sentence. No trace of realization remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. So to be enlightened, my translation, to be enlightened is to live the truth of no permanence. There's nothing that we gain from enlightenment. In fact, we lose any type of permanent self, permanent distinctions. I can claim to be a Zen priest, but in the realm of emptiness, of enlightenment, that doesn't exist. It's just a thing that we all agree on, kind of like money. It's like, well, what is it? We agree that I'll give it to you, and then you'll give me something back. Same type of idea. But then, I still got robes on, I'm able to buy food with cash, but my credit card. And at no time in the future will any identity that we take on become permanent or stand separate from the rest of reality. another way I kind of started thinking about the self, I talked about this yesterday, a little, I think one that everybody's come into contact with is when you let a bathtub drain from water, you get that little water tornado. Have everyone seen that? Yeah, okay, I'm not the only one. Like, no, you're the only one. Okay, so you see the little tornado guy, the whirlpool. It looks like a thing that you can just pick up with your hand, right? And hold, like it has in essence a permanent self that is independent from everything else in the universe. But go ahead and try to grab it, right? You can't do it. Because all it is just, I keep saying it, a confluence of causes and conditions. You need to have a certain amount of water. You need to have a drain set up. Apparently the Coriolis effect, something has to do with like the spinning of the earth as well. So you need to have a spinning earth in order for that to happen. And it exists for just as long as all of these particular conditions last. And you just, it's as fun as it would be to pick that thing up. It's impossible because it's not a separate thing. Intimately intertwined with the entire situation, just like us. You think you can pick one piece of me? You think I could pick my mother out of my body? Impossible. You can't do that. But that's one element. That's like the level of the water in the tornado. She's here. Whenever you hear me like giggling oddly, that's my mother coming out. Like that. Yeah. So that's probably still feels more philosophical, I think, right? Like talking about these sentences from Dogen, but I'll try to move it into more of a practice aspect of it. At first, when we sit down in Zazen, there might be like the pain in the body or the storm in your mind. We try to create the conditions for our bodies and our minds to be more comfortable. And the way to kind of do that is just by, like I said earlier, looking. Think about that. Yeah, and as we start looking at what's going on in the body and mind while we're sitting on the cushion, we start like seeing all these different, at least for, like I was saying, for me, memories will start popping up, karma, basically. And if you can really look closely in at how you deal with the pain that arises in sitting, that's just a little data point that you have about yourself. So do, like me sometimes, I'll sit there forever and kind of move around, trying to get that foot into the perfect spot. Sometimes you can get the foot into the perfect spot. Other times you can't get the foot into the perfect spot. But for Zazen, what we're really interested in is our relationship with that moving. Like, do we tell ourselves, like, oh, you're terrible, you sit Zazen terrible because your foot moves, and now you're moving your foot, like, I'm just the worst Zazen person. Or on a day where everything just feels great, do you tell yourself, I'm just the best Zazener that there is, I'm like the best one, everything went perfectly, no critiques, no comments. That's the self that's popping up right there. It's the self that you're studying. It's all those little words, that subtle grasping, and you're always looking for things like that. Or like when, thoughts of exes from high school pop up all the time, like I said, all the time in Zazen for some reason, and I'm just like, oh, I was like a terrible, horrible person. Oh, I shouldn't have done that. That's the self coming up again, looking at what's happening, critiquing it. It's my relationship to that little bit of suffering that is popping up. Yeah, what I try to do is be like, so why am I thinking of that right now? And what does that tell me about me now? And how can I take that, out to the world and try to lessen my suffering and other people's sufferings. The way I always like to put it is, we look at how we have very unskillful ways of dealing with, what's happening in Zazen. Like with that foot, maybe like I said, the foot hurts, then start telling yourself that you're horrible because the foot hurts. You can kind of see that almost as like studying your notes for a test. You've got all the answers right here and you're getting them, and then you go out into the actual world, which is your test. So for me, it's always on the road. Someone zips by, and I can feel that anger rise up, and because I've been on the cushion for so long studying myself, I've got at least a little glimmer of how I deal with situations that make me uncomfortable or angry. A lot of times for me, like to take that uncomfortableness and throw it out at someone, like, you take it. Like it comes out as anger for me. That's all the karma again, going all the way back. But now, since I've been studying the self on the cushion, I have that data point about myself where I'm like, oh, I know that when I go out on the road, I have to be watching myself, just like I do during Zazen, to make sure that I'm not causing this dukkha. The dukkha is going to arise because of the causes and conditions, but I don't react to it in the way that I have taught myself or been taught over the years. So just being very careful, just watching. Yeah. To this last sentence. The ego wants to exist. It can only exist when egoing. So, like I said, when you're on that cushion, this is from yesterday. I don't know. I'm not repeating myself, but when you're in a conversation and it becomes quiet and it feels very awkward, and you just kind of want to fill that silence with words. That's the ego there. Same thing happens during Zazen. I think it has been for me for this last week or so. When things get really quiet, my ego feels just as awkward as if I were in a pause or a lull in a conversation with other people, and it just starts egoing, starts talking, starts thinking of things, throwing thoughts out, like, what about this, what about this, what about this? And because it's so quiet, I'm like, oh, let's fill this silence where I should just be watching things with, following after those thoughts, those little treats that my ego is dangling in front of me. So for us, it's really, we're trying to be like, no, we're just going to sit in that silence with ourselves as if we were sitting in a silence with others. I have the last little cap on this. So that's why it's so important to study the self, so that we can become aware of the various tricks that it pulls. It pulls these tricks in order to manipulate us into creating conditions for its own arising. And we know that delusions are inexhaustible, and the self, if nothing, is a master of delusions and trickery. This is why Dogen says that realization or enlightenment is a practice, because there are inexhaustible ways for the self to trick us into setting up the conditions for it to arise, and for us to kind of buy into its nonsense, like those little treats, those little thought treats that'll dangle for us. So we always have to be on the lookout for that self as it's arising. Because the self, just like anything else, it's impermanent and it flows like a river. And if we think that it's just, this one singular thing, then we'll never see it coming, because it puts on different outfits and comes after us, so to speak. So in closing, I wish for all of our practice to reveal the self in all of its various transformations, and that we can use that knowledge that we've gained to end our suffering and the suffering of others. If anybody has any questions, Dogen's always somewhat esoteric. Does that make sense though, When you're sitting on the Zazen cushion, you're really just trying to see what is happening. And you use your knowledge of what's happening to understand how you create your own suffering, and then take that out in the world and make suffering for other people. So you want to do the opposite. Find that compassion for yourself so that you can bring compassion to others. We can sit in the uncomfortable silence with ourselves like we will know. Okay. Everybody? Okay. See if I can. I've been catching up on all these things I've never memorized. So we'll see if I can do this. I'll take a deep. What is it? Okay. May this merit extend universally to all, so that we, together with all beings, realize the Buddha way.
All Buddhas throughout space and time, all honored ones, bodhisattvas, mahasattvas, wisdom beyond wisdom, Maharajya, Paramita.
We can get our cushions back into order. We'll do our final bow and then call it a day.